I am married to a beautiful woman, and if you know us, you know I just speak the truth on that. She is beautiful physically to me, very beautiful, but her real beauty is inward. She is the kind of woman that Peter's talking about here in First Peter chapter 3. Uh, it's a great picture. It's a picture I would hope any Christian woman would want to grow in their own life, but it's difficult. The difficult part is not so much where her beauty would come from. It should be that of your inner self. This is in verse 4. The unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. Now it's going to get a little more difficult. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. This whole idea of submitting I think it comes down to the God's design for marriage and the family. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes about husbands and wives, beginning with wives, and he talks about the very same hierarchy. I hate to use that word, but I'm going to say structure for the family. And he places the husband as the head of the house, the head of the marriage. In fact, he says the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. Now, the only way this structure is going to work well is when a husband honors his wife the way Jesus honors the church. He protects the church. He nurtures the church. He loves the church. He honors the church by embracing it in relationship. This is supposed to be the model for the husband. And the wife, I think I have to do this just by projection, but I think that a wife who feels that level of security, that level of confidence that her husband is not ruling over her as a dominant dictator, but is the head of the relationship as Christ is the head of the church. He is a loving protector, provider, nurturer, lover. Well, in that case, it would not be quite so hard for the wife to submit, to voluntarily align herself under the authority of her husband. That's what Sarah did. She obeyed Abraham. Now, this is an interesting thing because if you go back to the Genesis story of Abraham and Sarah, she was not always this wallflower, compliant, mousy little, I'll do anything you say, dear woman. She was a strong-willed woman with her own agenda, her own plan, and she was fairly powerful with that plan. But here, Peter points to her and says that she obeyed Abraham, and she really did. Well, then this last sentence in verse 6, you are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. And this is interesting to me because now we're into not just an attitudinal thing, but we're almost into the behavioral realm. See, attitudes are very elusive in terms of evaluation. How do you judge someone's attitude? Well, you judge their attitude by their countenance and their behavior, their words. But without those things, it's very difficult to evaluate or judge or even observe someone's attitude. Well, a godly wife demonstrates her attitude toward God's design, toward God himself, toward her husband, by her behaviors within that relationship. And I know that sounds archaic. And if it is, I'm okay with that. Because I know this is the only way a healthy, robust, growing marriage works. Well, you, Peter writes, to believing wives are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. To be a daughter of Sarah is a very Hebrew concept. Abraham and Sarah were the starting point people for the whole Jewish race. And as far as women in the Jewish race, Sarah would have been the most exalted, and her example would have been the most shining example. To be her daughter means to be within her lineage, within her example, within her model. And that was a desirable thing for Hebrew Jewish women. And Peter, because he is writing primarily to Jews, converted Jews, he casts this back. The Holy Spirit guides him to cast this back to Sarah as the mama son, if I can say it that way, maybe the godmother. But they are her daughters if they do what is right. Well, that's a pretty broad statement. I think you can pinpoint a little bit more what he is referring to in terms of what is right when you look at the context of that statement here. What is right is this observance of the structure, God's structure for a marriage, where the husband is the head, not the dominant, not the dictator. He is the head. He is the leader. And the wife, I keep using this phrase because it's the best phrase I know for it. She voluntarily aligns herself beneath the authority of her husband. When women do that, they enhance their husband's ability to lead. We're going to talk about husbands next. It may take us till the next installment, but we're going to talk about husbands next. And their responsibility is not light. If you're going to be the head of any organization, and the family is an organization, but if you're going to be the head, you have strong responsibilities to execute on. And this is the case with husbands. But Peter's words, you're her daughter, you're Sarah's daughter if you do what is right. And I think another way for me to say that would be if you follow Sarah's example by doing what is right, you front load the relationship with a power that if you don't do that, that power is simply not available to the family. Have you ever observed marriages where there is this constant battle for control? Who will lead? Who will follow? Who has the best ideas? Who needs to shut up and stay quiet? Who needs to, those kinds of things where either the husband or the wife or both of them are going at it. And sometimes that's the result of two alphas marrying. Alphas make great leaders, but sometimes they don't make such great followers unless they're growing in their maturity as individuals, and especially for Christians. As we grow mature in our walk with Christ, even an alpha can learn how to follow well. Well, in the best cases, you don't follow because you're forced to. You follow because you decide to. This is an act of your will. I keep coming back to this. For wives, your following the lead of your husband is an act of your will. It's very difficult when you don't respect your husband. It's very difficult when your husband, let's be honest, doesn't deserve your respect. What do you do in those cases? Well, I know I'm kind of stretching this, but Peter writes, "You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear." I think one of the biggest fears that a wife would have is that her husband will not love her well. With that fear, you set the whole family structure up to be at risk. When a wife fears that her husband is disloyal to her, when a wife fears that her husband has stepped out on her, when, in a less extreme case, when a wife fears that her husband really doesn't have her best interest at heart, and if there are children involved, when a wife fears that her husband will not provide well for her whole family and take care of her kids the way she would want them to be taken care of, that fear is very powerful, and it can drive some very negative behaviors. Ultimately, on a theological level, the greatest fear that any of us can have is that God will not do what we think he should do. Now, in its most mature form, this is a fear of the idea that God won't do what he's promised to do. The less mature we are, the more that becomes not that God would do what he has promised that he would do, and more that he won't do what I want him to do. You see how that works? And in a marriage, when a wife is afraid that her husband won't measure up, that he won't lead well, that he won't be the provider and protector, that he won't fill this role of headship well, that's a fear that can really dismantle a marriage. Well, think about any relationship. When you fear that the other person in the relationship is not taking you seriously, is not taking your needs seriously, has no regard for what you feel your needs are, how would you describe that relationship? Just two words, in my opinion: not good. I think in this whole structural thing that Peter's drawing a picture for, and I've drawn it out so long, it's hard to imagine that there is this context, because we're only looking at this part of it. But for a wife to give way to the fear that she won't be cared for, she won't be cherished, she won't be treasured, or she isn't cared for, she isn't cherished, she isn't treasured, for her to give way to that fear basically paves the way for the dismantling of the whole marriage. You know, there's a theory, a psychological theory, that when our expectations often set the performance of the other. In other words, let's take it as a sports illustration. Sorry, girls, I don't have a feminine illustration for this, but when a coach coaches his team, you're not going to hear him coming in at halftime and on a rant about what a bunch of losers you guys are. You couldn't execute yourself out of the bathroom. You're on that field getting beat up, coming and going. And you know why? It's because you stink. You're awful. You couldn't do this. I wish I could replace you. You know, a coach might feel that. He might think about it. A good coach is not going to say that. A good coach is going to come in at halftime and go, okay, guys, we're not playing up to our ability. We're not executing like we're capable of. Come on, let's think this through. Let's move toward what you are capable of. Obviously, I'm not a good football, basketball, hockey, table tennis coach, but I do know that when your assumption is that another is going to produce at a certain level because they are capable, because they are innately valuable in that way, they're much more likely to achieve that. I think this is very true of wives toward their husbands. Wives who live and act in fear that their husbands are not good. That's a tough place to be in when your husband is truly not good, when he doesn't follow Christ, when he doesn't adhere to God's design for the marriage. This is a horrible thing. It puts you in a tough spot. But you have to learn, and I don't want to be mean about this, but for your life to work, you have to learn how to not give way to that fear. And the only way I know is to replace that fear with confidence in the only one who is fully, completely trustworthy. And that is our God. Next time we're going to talk about husbands, finally, and wives can take a deep breath and, be amused. Well, I hope I get to connect with you again this way next time. And I'd love it if you'd bring a friend for Soul Care with Stevie Boy.